Hello everybody, welcome back to Momo vs. MTG. Today I have a bit of a commander discussion video on the format in general, mainly pertaining to my casual players to higher end casual players. The question I have is, are there any cards that you just couldn't pull yourself together to throw into one of your decks, whether it be casual, higher end, or so forth? Or are you on the other end of the spectrum where it's a singleton format? You throw any card you like, you see, throw in a deck, why not? Bada bing, and you got it. Um, and really, what I'm trying to get at is I feel that some of these cards, especially when you compound them and throw multiple into a deck, really increases the power level and questions whether or not your deck is really suited for casual play and it's approaching higher end power to even pre EDH, CEDH kind of deal. Or on the other end, I feel like there are a couple cards that, let's say you just run an Esper Sentinel for value and is not, in conjunction with Mana Crypt, Doxi Voidwalker, Jeweled Lotus, maybe it's not as game breaking. And even we have Demonic Tutor here, maybe you're just tutoring for a janky combo kind of deal, so you throw one of those into your deck. So I'm really curious on the situation, what you think of these cards. Would you run any of them, or do you have cards, let me know down below. Are there any cards that you just think, hey, if I see this card, man, that's really not shaping the deck to be casual? So moving on from there, let's take a look at some of these cards. And a quick disclaimer, this is not to throw any heat if you run some of these cards. This is just my personal opinion on the format. And the great thing about Commander format is everyone has their own ideas about it in general. And that's what makes it perfectly cool. And that's what makes horse races, right? Everyone has their own ideas. So moving forward from there, let's take a look at Doxi Extortionist. This is one card that I would not, put into especially one of my casual decks. And really the crux of the situation here is, I'll put it as an example, is if you draw this card in your casual deck, it could shape it into a game state that would otherwise generally not happen and really fluctuates, your deck in general based off if you draw this or not, right? You know, you draw this early on, people have some, artifacts out. And again, this card gets better the higher power you're playing because there's generally more cheaper artifacts and so forth. However, for 2 mana, if it nets you maybe 10 treasures, which is not that hard in the Commander format since we run, artifact lands, we run artifact talismans, arcane signets, all other kinds of signets and stuff, because especially outside of green, generally the signets in that kind of ramp is our best options when it comes to building our decks. And Doxi Extortionist really takes advantage of this, I think to a certain degree, that really, shapes the format around it. And especially once you get into either, making copies of it, flickering it, bouncing it, you get into some crazy board states that really, I think, geared towards less the casual play. And what really happens, I believe, is your deck performs in a different way and kind of makes it less consistent because you'll have some explosive turns where you drop a Dockside out and then maybe put yourself so far ahead that no one can do anything about it. Or if you never draw it, it could leave you in the opposite state, right? But someone drops a Dockside Extortion across the table, they make 20 treasures. I look at that and say, hey, maybe the game would have shaped up a lot differently if they didn't just do that for 2 mana. It's because it's such a powerful card by itself. Someone's making 20 mana with some other method, maybe, requires a little more setup, that's a different story. But on its own, Dockside is such a powerful card that it can create that state in the game. So, just as an example, as my personal opinion, and instead of Doxi Extortionist, I might run something like Jessica's Will or Prismaria. Everyone knows Jessica's Will. It can net you a ton of mana, ritual effect, happens once, or it can put you, give you some card advantage. So a nice option there. A lot of people know about Jessica's Will, or something like Prismaria, where it creates a treasure token for you, and then you can use those treasure tokens repeatedly to cast instants or sorceries. Right, so this is just a quick example of the situation where something like this, I feel like, is more suited for casual play, these type of cards. And if you have different opinions, love to know. Let me know down below, or rage at me in the DMs. Either way, perfectly fine. But again, this is just my humble opinion. Um, and yeah, so going forward from there, another card I just wouldn't pull myself to put into a casual deck is Cyclonic Rift. And especially overloaded, right? It's on its own. Maybe you run the Cyclonic Rift for the singleton part, sure. But an instant speed, quote unquote board wipe is very powerful for the format, and I feel like shapes games into a very different direction. The general idea of board wipes are, yeah, he spends his turn casting the board wipe, but that requires his whole turn basically, or maybe he can't follow up as much as possible, or it hits some of his own stuff. But Cyclonic Rift is the definition of a one-sided board wipe that really has no build around. You take a look at something like Dusk Dawn, where it destroys all creatures with 3 power or greater, and you're running a deck that really is either 0 power or less than 3 in general, right? So that board wipe really only hits most of your opponent's creatures. Cyclonic Rift is a special case where all you have to do is pay some extra mana, and it basically gets rid of your opponent's boards without any conditions being met. And again, another card I'll compare maybe is like Farewell, where it exiles the entire board. Not a lot of people like that card too much, but in my head, it's like it's a mutual effect across the, entire board state. Hits your own stuff, hits your opponent's stuffs, etc., etc. And the real kicker of this card is that instant speed. So usually on someone's end step, you bounce all their stuff, and the next turn you're swinging for game or getting so far ahead that it's difficult for your opponents to get back in. And it's a really game defining play, and really sets up questions in my mind. Is this a real casual card or not? And I think not. But again, really I'd like to know your opinions. So instead of Cyclonic Rift, I like to run something like an Aether Spouts. Especially if you still want that instant speed. It gets rid of all the attacking creatures, puts it on the top or bottom of their library, so I think it's a nice, especially that one big stompy battlecruiser player, which I've talked about, gets rid of their creatures and maybe evens out the playing field a little bit. Or something like Time Wipe, right? If you want to still protect your own stuff in a way, you can Time Wipe, return a creature to its owner hand, and then destroy all creatures. So you keep your best creature, kind of board wipe, maybe reset the game a little bit, or slow down someone who's really far ahead early on. Whatever situation arouses. So this is just maybe a couple options. Maybe you have your own board wipes. Just a couple to throw out there. Moving on from Cyclonic Rift, we have Burgeoning. So for green mana, you get this funny enchantment that says whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. And especially for casual play, this is basically equivalent to maybe a fast spawn. Because you start with 7, 8 cards. If you draw your first turn, you play a Burgeoning. Fast spawn is a banned card in the Commander format for good reason. Because we start with so much life and it deals 1 damage to you, but you can play as many lands as you want. About the time you were to fast spawn out all this mana, Burgeoning kind of does the same thing, where everyone's probably going to be playing at least 1 land on their first turn, if a fetch land 2, right? And you could probably empty out your hand of lands by turn 2, and especially for a Commander format, is very powerful. Pretty game shaping, especially as being the first play of the game. You could probably get out your 5 or 6 drop Commander while someone has 1 land or less, or really no way to interact with that. But again, you're going all in on this. So, but Burgeoning is a personal card I wouldn't consider for a casual deck. If you run it, again, by all means, just my humble opinion. So instead of Burgeoning, some cards I take a look at is maybe Exploration, where so for the same mana, you get to play an additional land. That to me is like the equivalent. You're playing 2 lands a turn instead of, emptying out your hand of lands usually when, your opponents play a land. There's really no downside to Burgeoning in that sense, right? All they have to do is play a land. Exploration lets you accrue value, start to get ahead, that kind of deal. Or maybe if you still want that effect, really interesting, neat card I found is Mana Bond, right? reads at the beginning or end step, you may reveal your hand and put all land cards from it onto the battlefield. If you do, discard your hand. So this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, where if you do want to ramp pretty furiously, pretty hard, it has a cost, right? Where you have to discard your hand. I have one deck that runs this. I think it's a pretty neat card for the deck. However, the cost of it is pretty up there. So you usually, generally probably not to be running this in most of your commander decks. So, just some options there. Throwing out there. Moving on. And if you haven't guessed it by now, the next card is Smothering Tide. Do you pay the 2 tribal? So for 4 mana, you get enchantment. Whenever opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a treasure token. So this is the type of card that, white decks usually have, generally speaking, a harder time ramping than others. And some people look at this card and say, hey, it's the best white ramp card. White needs options to ramp up. But again, I see this come down in a casual format. A lot of people aren't paying the 2, but even if you are, you may have one player who isn't, right? Or if you're drawing just cards as value over time, that Smothering Tide player is going to be taking huge advantage of this and generating so much treasure, so much mana, that kind of really shapes the game into a different direction. If you're a nice, responsible table, you all pay the 2. Creates a different game, but generally speaking, Smothering Tide can put someone super far ahead just on its own, and just like that. And so instead of Smothering Tide, I may run something like Arommancer's Map, right? It's a nice card. Search for 2 playing cards, put them in your hand, and whenever the land enters the battlefield under opponent control, if that player controls more lands than you, you can put a land from your hand on the battlefield. So white has this neat catch-up mechanic. I think is pretty interesting, where you can play more lands if someone else is ramping far ahead. Let's say you have a green player at the table, constantly tutoring for lands. Arommancer Map is there to kind of put you even on that front. And then Deep Gnome Terramancer for 2, right? Has flash. Whenever one or more lands enters the battlefield under opponent's control without being played, you can search for your library for a plains card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Do this only once each turn. So again, I feel like it's a more fair, more balanced card towards casual play, where if someone's ramping far ahead, and even the fetch lands too, this kind of gets too, right? Because it's, again, a fetch land goes get the land and it's not being played technically, you can kind of catch up on the mechanic of lands that way. So again, 2 options that I see could be serving the same purpose, or just as good, in my opinion, these 2 cards here. And you haven't guessed it by now, the last one I'd like to take a look at is Ristic Study. For 3 mana enchantment, whenever opponent casts a spell, that player may draw a card unless that player pays 1, right? Do you pay the 1 tribal? This kind of card, I feel like in a casual format, is pretty game defining, and really can set tempo of the game that otherwise generally wouldn't be happening. If you don't draw this card, your deck probably wouldn't be in the same situation if it did by a good margin. Is generally people don't like to pay the 1, and maybe that's on them. Maybe you say, hey, if they just paid the 1, they wouldn't be in the situation. But again, if you have this early on, people are still ramping up, maybe doing something else, it's tough to pay the 1, but again, that's on the player themselves. So it's really a sticky situation there. But again, this is just a card I wouldn't put in my deck if I'm trying to consider it more casual. But some cards I would, put there instead. Maybe a Mystic Remora. And again, maybe this is a card here that someone else would say, hey, I couldn't even put this in one of my casual decks because it's really good. So whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless the player plays 4. So again, you're saying, hey, it's the same effect, but it has the cumulative upkeep. So this one has a bit of a cost. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter as permanent, then sacrifice it unless its upkeep cost is paid for each age counter. So you're basically saying, especially early on, hey, would I rather, have maybe a chance at some card draw, spending my mana that way, not developing in other sense, or do I just let the Mystic Remora go? Maybe I drew a couple cards. I have enough cards. Let me do something else. So I do like that dynamic of Mystic Remora in that sense. at least in my eyes, or something like a Fairy Mastermind, which, again, some of these cards are considered, CDH, but I feel like on their own and not in conjunction with other cards, um, they can be left to a more casual format. So as Flash Flying, whenever our opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card. So again, if you want some nice card advantage, I like these as options, and really relies more on your opponents in that kind of sense, and really not, on their own, they're great cards, but not really, game breaking, design, I feel like, to put you in a state that otherwise wouldn't happen, a very skewed power level in that kind of sense. And again, this was a very touchy subject. Coming across the table, I'm probably going to get comments in either direction, but I just want to throw it out there. Just, the philosophy behind my deck building, why I include some cards, why I don't include some other cards. And again, it all varies from deck to deck. For instance, again, if you run some tutors, maybe you're trying to tutor up a janky combo, in a sense, we're not trying to tutor up, your win con on the spot, that kind of deal. Really varies. And again, the most important thing is it varies player to player. One way or another, everyone has ideas in the Commander format, and that's what makes it such a beautiful thing. And that's what keeps me coming back, playing every week, is I like to see, people's opinions, and especially their decks, why they decide on certain cards, what's the reasoning, one way or another. That to me is very interesting, and, I hope that, maybe you find this interesting, or at least either you learn something from it, or at least at the very minimum, mildly entertaining. And especially if you've been here this far. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. End of discussion. Again, I'd like to know your comments, your thoughts down below in the comments, or reach out to me angrily in DMs. I'm open for anything. So thanks for hanging out with me. Until the next one, this has been Momo versus MTG. Take care.